Welcome back. This is day 11 of Ecology, and today we're going to be talking about some ways that humans impact the environment around us. But before we get to that, you guys have got a do now question. So I want you to go ahead and pause this video and identify and define the 3 types of symbiosis, as well as give an example of each, and press play when you're ready to review it. All right, so you may have noticed that I gave you a hint as to some examples of symbiosis on this page, but it was up to you to figure out which type of symbiosis each of these are. So the first type of symbiosis is known as mutualism, and this is when both species benefit from this relationship. So an example of mutualism here is going to be this: a sea anemone and a clownfish. Both of these species benefit from their friendship, so it is known as mutualism. All right, next up, we've got parasitism. This is a little bit more of a toxic relationship because with parasitism, one species benefits, but the other is harmed. Okay, so an example of this would be a tick and a dog. In this example, a tick is a parasite that is latching onto the dog as its host and is going to ultimately harm the dog involved. All right, and the third type of symbiosis is commensalism. And with commensalism, one species benefits from this relationship, but the other is just kind of unbothered by the whole thing. It's unaffected. It's not benefiting from it, but it's also not harmed by it. It's just kind of indifferent to the situation. So an example of this would be a whale and a barnacle. In this relationship, the barnacle is benefiting, but the whale is unaffected. All right. Now, today we're going to be talking about something known as keystone species, which I'll tell you more about in just a second. But I do want to tell you that both of the passages we're reading today have been on Regents exams before. So if you are still taking the Regents this year, pay special attention to these passages because these are examples of what those short answer questions that you'll see on the Regents will look like. Right, so again, we're going to read through these passages and then you guys are going to use this information to answer the questions that follow. So now, what are keystone species? Well, a keystone species is one whose presence contributes to the diversity of life and whose extinction would lead to the extinction of other forms of life. So most importantly, a keystone species helps to support the ecosystem of which it is a part. So keystone species are very, very important to maintaining stability in an ecosystem. And we'll look at some examples of this in just a minute, including an example of what can happen when a keystone species is removed occurred when fur hunters eliminated sea otters from some Pacific Ocean kelp beds. Now, when we're seeing this word fur hunters, that means we're talking about humans who came in and decided to hunt these sea otters for their fur. Otters eat sea urchins, which eat kelp. With its major predator gone, sea urchin populations exploded and consumed most of the kelp. So because of this, fish, snails, and other animals associated with the kelp beds disappeared. The grizzly bear is another example of a keystone species. Grizzlies transfer nutrients from the ocean ecosystem to the forest ecosystem. The first stage of this transfer is performed by salmon that swim up rivers, sometimes for hundreds of miles. Salmon are rich in nitrogen, sulfur, carbon, and phosphorus. The bears capture the salmon and carry them onto dry land, scattering nutrient-rich feces, wastes, and partially eaten carcasses. It has been estimated that the bears leave up to half of the salmon they harvest on the forest floor. So now let's look at a picture showing us the effect that these keystone species have on an ecosystem. Now, this keystone species was not mentioned in the passage, but another example of one is the shark. So in this example on the left, we see that sharks are apex predators and feed on the cow-nose rays that we see right here. And then cow-nose rays are going to feed on the bivalves and arthropods we see down here. And so because each of these organisms keep the other populations in check, this means that the bivalve and arthropod populations are stable. So again, this keystone species keeps the ecosystem stable. But what happens when we remove that keystone species from an area? Well, first we need to know that they're removed from an area due to overfishing, which again is a result of human activity, where humans come in and overfish and fish more of these sharks faster than they can maintain their population size. Okay, so we're fishing more than they are reproducing. So because of this, this decimates the shark population and completely removes them from this ecosystem. And what effect does that have on the cow-nose rays? Well, suddenly those cow-nose rays no longer have any predators in that area, which means the cow-nose ray population is going to increase in number or overpopulate, which seems like a good thing for the cow-nose rays until you look at the bigger effect of this. So what's going to happen? Well, The cow-nosed rays, because there are more of them, that means they're going to be feeding more on this bivalve and arthropod populations. And since there are more rays feeding on this population, this means that the bivalve and arthropod populations are going to absolutely collapse. Their population size is going to decrease because they're all being eaten by these rays. But then this story isn't over, right? Because what happens when these populations collapse and there's no longer any food for the rays? Well, that's also going to then cause this cow-nosed population to decrease as well, because suddenly they don't have any food left. So just by removing this one predator from the area, it has completely decimated this entire ecosystem and ruined the stability. So you can see that this little graphic shows the collapse of the ecosystem, which really is what happens when we remove those keystone species. So another example of this was actually mentioned in the passage we read. So the sea otter is another example of a keystone species. And what happens is when that keystone sea otter is removed, sea urchins overgraze the kelp and destroy the kelp forest community. So we can see here on the left that these sea otters actually eat sea urchins. But when we remove those sea otters, those sea urchins no longer have any predators. We're going to see their population increase. But what happens when the sea urchin population increases? Well, they're going to start eating more of this kelp, which means that kelp population is going to decrease. And now, what's going to happen if those sea urchins no longer have any food? Well, they're going to decrease as well eventually. So again, keystone species are very, very important and maintain the stability of an ecosystem. Without those keystone species, it just ruins the ecosystem. Right. So now let's go back and answer some questions about that passage we read. So some people feel the grizzly bear should be eliminated from parts of its natural range. Describe the impact of this proposed action on the forest ecosystems in these areas if the bears are eliminated. Let's drop my pen. Support your answer with information from the passage. All right, so go ahead and pause this video, answer this question, and press play when you want to review it. All right, so if bears are eliminated from this ecosystem, remember bears are a keystone species here. If bears are eliminated, the forest ecosystem will not get the nitrogen, sulfur, carbon, and phosphorus it needs, since grizzly bears leave these elements. So the plants and animals that require these nutrients from the salmon carcasses would not be able to survive. So again, because these keystone species are eliminated, we would see that every other organism that depends on it would be affected, right? So the plants and animals that require or depend on the scattering of these nutrients and carcasses would no longer be able to survive without that keystone species. Right. And next up, the United States government does not allow travelers from foreign countries to bring plants, fruits, vegetables, animals, or other living organisms into this country. State one biological reason for keeping these out of the United States. Again, pause this video, press play when you're ready to review it. All right, so there are actually multiple answers to this question. You could have said that the imported organisms may contain parasites or diseases which could spread to organisms in our country. But you could have also said that some introduced species may compete with native species for food and habitat. And these introduced species may actually outcompete the native species we have, since they would have no natural predators here in the US. Right, so both of these are reasons why we might not want to bring other species that aren't native to the US into this environment, right? We saw what happened when we put rabbits on that island in Australia, okay? Not great for anyone involved. So the same thing could happen here because, again, there are no natural predators for those organisms here. Right. Now, next up, we've got another passage. Again, this has been on the Regents exam before, so if you are taking that Regents, pay special attention to these short answer questions. So this passage is called "There's No Place Like Home." Some pets need expensive food or grow to large sizes or have nasty, dangerous behaviors. Because of this, some people realize that they can no longer care for their pets. A pet twist-necked turtle in a state of near starvation was found by rescuers at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. The food that this species eats is not commonly found in New York State. In Florida and other warm states, people have released pet snakes such as pythons and anacondas into local lakes and swamps, where they have become a threat to other animals and even to humans. Those released pets that survive in their new environment can eventually breed and multiply, causing even more problems. So now, pause this video, answer questions 1 and 2, and press play when you're ready to review them. All right, number 1, Identify one abiotic factor that might affect the survival of a released pet and explain why that factor would affect survival. So remember, when we see this word abiotic, we're talking about non-living factors. So there are multiple answers you could have said for this. I've included two, but if you said something that I didn't mention on this video, just send me a quick message on Remind and we can double check that answer for you, okay? But one abiotic factor, one non-living factor that could affect this population or this survival is going to be lack of water, because without water, those animals will become dehydrated, which will interfere with cell functions and could eventually lead to death. Right? And another abiotic factor you could have mentioned is temperature, because different species are adapted to live in different climates. So again, if you mentioned another abiotic factor that I did not mention, send me a message and we can double check it. I'm pretty sure you're probably right. Right. And next up, what is the role of bacteria and fungi in an ecosystem? Well, hopefully we know by now that bacteria and fungi serve as decomposers. So they're going to break down dead organisms and recycle those nutrients back into the environment to be used again. And guys, that is your last question on your last notes worksheet of living environment. Give yourself a round of applause because you have officially made it. So all I need you to do now is complete your exit ticket, turn in these notes, and have a wonderful day knowing that you are done with ecology. Well, not done yet. We still have to do our Beaks of Finches lab, but we're almost done. 99% way of the way done. All right. Bye, guys. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I will see you guys tomorrow.